Hello everyone. I recently stated that I would no longer post additional videos and that my interpretation of the current situation was that there is little response or little appetite of health authorities to listen to our warnings and that we would have no choice but to wait and see how the situation is evolving. But now that there is seemingly a decision taken and a strong recommendation to also enroll youngsters in the COVID-19 mass vaccination campaign and even children, I have changed my mind and I feel like it is an obligation to continue and still do this very last video, because this is simply unacceptable, and it is just going to make the situation much worse. But where does this idea to now also enroll children and youngsters in the mass vaccination campaign come from? Well, there is actually today a lot of good news with regard to the results of these mass vaccination campaigns, and I will come back to this later on. But basically, the only thing that is still a little bit annoying, or what seems annoying to health authorities and officials, is that now we see a relatively large increase in younger people getting COVID-19 disease. And therefore, they think that the best solution to solve this problem is simply to vaccinate them as well. So then why would a guy like me, in light of all this good news, oppose mass vaccination? Because I'm not even pointing to all the secondary effects or the long-term effects that these vaccines may cause. This is something a number of other experts are deeply involved in and working on. I'm simply pointing to the epidemiological consequences of this mass vaccination. And again, I keep repeating that for me, this is, in terms of vaccine science, a blunder that is completely unprecedented. And I can of course understand that this situation is very confusing to people. On one hand side, hearing all this good news in the media, and as I was saying, I will come back to this, about the success of these mass vaccination campaigns. And on the other hand, hearing people like me and others say that this is in fact going to be, if it doesn't stop, this is going to cause a catastrophe. And that is also the reason why I will undertake a very last and ultimate attempt to explain in as simple words as I can what is currently going on and why so many people don't see what's coming. And I like to compare this with an iceberg, where we see today, in the short term, we see the tip of the iceberg, which is very bright, which is sun-drenched, right? But the dark bulk of the iceberg is underwater. And you can only see this when you basically take a dive into the water. And so, but let's first get back to the good news that we are hearing and seeing today, and which I need to confirm, which is, for example, the fact that we are seeing a decrease in many countries that are well advanced with their mass vaccination campaigns. We are seeing a decline in the morbidity and the mortality rates. We see that there is less illness in people who got vaccinated. And we also see that these people are, even if they are infected with variants, they are still capable of resisting severe disease. And also, if they don't get the disease, they will shed less virus. Even when infected with variants, they will shed much less virus compared to somebody who would not be vaccinated. And on top, the seropositivity rates are increasing in the population thanks to vaccination. And that also gives officials and some expert advisors hope that we will soon reach herd immunity, which I completely disagree with, as I have explained recently in one of the Q&As. So, despite all this good news, and these are facts and data, why then am I saying that this pandemic is not at all moving into the right direction? And in order to be able to understand this, one has to take a look at the effect of mass vaccination on the transmission dynamics of this pandemic, the transmission of the variants, and also the evolution of the variants. Because when I'm saying that it's not evolving or going into the right direction, it is, of course, due to the variants. So let's maybe have a look at, and I've made a cartoon to make this more clear, hopefully. And if we look at, for example, the situation that is currently most representative, or the most representative situation which is occurring in many countries right now, we see that we are starting these mass vaccinations on what I call a background of relatively high morbidity. So this is to say that countries often start mass vaccination when, of course, there is already a substantial number of cases of disease and infection rates are high. So what is then happening is very clearly the following. You see that people who are vulnerable, so typically the elderly, will get the disease. And they can, of course, also infect other vulnerable people. But when the infection pressure increases, when many people get the illness, and especially people who get the disease shed a lot of virus, the infectious pressure will increase. And then it's even possible that even people at a younger age that are less vulnerable and who were previously protected due to their natural immunity get a disease. And I have explained this multiple times, that this is due to the fact that when the infectious pressure increases, the likelihood that somebody who got previously protected was asymptomatically infected will now be exposed to the virus at a time where his long-lived antibodies are still present, then this person becomes much more susceptible, because the short-lived antibodies that are directed against the spike protein will suppress the natural antibodies. And so the increase in infectious pressure is clearly responsible for shifting to some extent the disease to a younger population group. And that is what we have been seeing all along in several different countries. So now, when you start to mass vaccinate people, what is going to happen? Well, first of all, very clearly, you will prevent in a substantial way the number of cases of disease, because you will protect vulnerable people essentially when you start your vaccination campaign in this most vulnerable group. For example, the elderly, people who are immunosuppressed, etc., and have underlying diseases. But on top, because you protect these people from disease, so there will be much less virus shed and much less virus circulating, you will automatically have a beneficial impact also on younger age groups, because you will also indirectly protect them from becoming more susceptible and getting the disease. So that is what we are currently seeing, the effect of the mass vaccination, where the mortality and morbidity rates are going down to some extent in a very spectacular way, one must say. So, but what does this mean? What does this now mean in terms of virus transmission, virus circulation in, for example, the people who get vaccinated? Because what we know is that people who are vaccinated, they cannot completely eliminate the virus when they are infected, when they become infected. Why is this? Well, there's a number of reasons, but bear in mind that variants were already circulating before we started the mass vaccination campaigns. And so when people who are vaccinated come in contact with variants, they cannot eliminate this virus completely, because their vaccinal antibodies do not match very, very well with the spike protein of the variants, because the spike protein in the variants is a different version, as you all know, from the one that is used in the vaccines. So that means that these vaccinees can still spread the virus, right? That is one thing. On the other hand, these people are also subject to very often suboptimal immune pressure. What I mean by this is that when they are in the process of mounting antibodies after the first shot, between the first and the second shot, etc., their antibodies are still not optimal. And so when you combine all these factors, the low infectious pressure, or the lowered infectious pressure due to mass vaccination, combined with the fact that the asymptomatically infected vaccinees can still spread the virus, and this combined with suboptimal immune pressures, this makes, in fact, of vaccinees a kind of reservoir where the virus can circulate, and where variants that have mutations that enable them to become more infectious, that enable the variant to become more infectious, will have a competitive advantage. So this is to say that these mutations will allow more infectious variants to dominate in the population, simply because they are going to be able to reproduce more effectively under these conditions than the wild strain. So this means that you are generating a kind of breeding ground, and that will expand the more you vaccinate, the more this breeding ground that consists of asymptomatically infected vaccinees will expand. And so will evolve the infectiousness of those variants. So now, when variants become more infectious, and when more infectious variants become dominant in the population, you will, of course, almost per definition, increase the infectious pressure. And when you increase the infectious pressure, you are facing again the same situation as before, namely that the people who are completely healthy and were not vaccinated, they will now have higher chance of getting reinfected while they are still having suboptimal antibodies that suppress their natural antibodies. So in other words, if the infectious pressure increases, the likelihood that somebody who is not vaccinated becomes now more susceptible to the disease increases. And that was not previously the case, because remember, if variants circulate, vaccinated people may breed them and may bring them to a higher level of infectiousness, but normally as long as the infectious pressure is relatively low, people who are not vaccinated and healthy, they are perfectly capable of coping with all these variants because their natural antibodies, their innate antibodies, do not discriminate between those variants. But the disadvantage of natural immunity, of natural antibodies, is always that they cannot cope with a high load. This is well described in the literature. Natural innate antibodies cannot cope with a high viral load. So when the infectious pressure increases, that becomes a problem for the non-vaccinated people. And hence, we are going to see that as a result of that, we are now going to see increased morbidity in non-vaccinated people. And so there is an interesting observation, and I will come back to this, but and it has to do really with the enhanced enrollment of younger people. So on one hand side, one will see that what you gain on one hand side, the protection of, for example, the elderly and the diminished number of cases of mortality and morbidity, you will lose this advantage when the vaccination campaigns are advancing and when the vaccine coverage rate increases, because you will now start to generate more infectious variants, or infectious variants that existed already, you will promote their propagation because you're generating conditions that are just fantastic for these most infectious variants. And by doing so, you increase the morbidity and the mortality in the non-vaccinated people. So what you gain on one hand side, you're losing it on the other hand side. And it's very clear that the more youngsters and the more children you will enroll in those campaigns, the more the increased susceptibility of the non-vaccinated group will outweigh, in fact, the benefit of vaccinating the elderly and the vulnerable people. So that is very, very important to bear in mind. So what does this mean when we now do the mathematics and the calculations, or we have a more mathematical representation of this? If you look at the following curves, so what you will see in the first curve, and on the y-axis we have the reproduction number, which is a measure for the infectious pressure, and which parallels usually the rate of morbidity. And on the x-axis you have the vaccine coverage rate. And so when vaccine coverage rates increase, you have a decrease in the infectious pressure, decrease in morbidity, etc. We discussed this already, and that's what we are seeing right now. So, but what happens is that at some point in time, you will start to see more and more infectious variants circulating. And that is the next curve that you're seeing in red, where you see that after a lag time, there will be, you're breeding, in fact, the vaccinees are breeding more infectious variants. And due to these more infectious variants, the infectious pressure will increase. And as this infectious pressure increases, also the likelihood that non-vaccinated people become ill increases. So, in fact, to have a realistic or a real idea of the total infectious pressure that is occurring in a population, you have, in fact, to add these both curves. And because on one hand side there is a strong diminishment, but on the other hand side, the infectious pressure due to the more infectious variants is increasing. And when you add up both components, we end up with what we call the resultant. And when you look at this, the resultant, you will see that, well, first of all, you have the decrease in the infectious pressure, but then at some point, and it's indicated by A, you will have a kind of plateau. This decline will decrease because you have now increased infectious pressure due to the circulating more infectious variants. And this plateau will continue till the increase in the infectious pressure due to the more infectious variants is no longer compensated by the decrease in the infectious pressure that is due to a decrease in morbidity in the vaccinated people. So that infectious pressure will then ultimately go up again. So why are we not made aware of this? Why are we not seeing this? Well, remember, before we vaccinate, when we talk about infectivity, when we talk about reproduction number, when we talk about infectious pressure, before we vaccinate, we take into account all groups. This is to say, we not only the people who get the disease are tested, of course also people who die are tested, but also people who are completely healthy, and they were also to some extent tested to see what is the infectious pressure in the population. Now, interestingly enough, after we have started vaccination, we no longer test healthy people, although all we have been doing is turning these healthy people into vaccinees, into healthy vaccinees. So why all of a sudden we do not longer test vaccinees, healthy vaccinees? We tested them before they were vaccinated, because this gave us a good impression of the rate of positivity, of positive tests in the population. Once we vaccinate them, countries have stopped and health officials have stopped to recommend testing vaccinees. And that is why we are completely missing this infectious pressure that is now building up due to the more infectious variants circulating. This is to say, we do not test people who are vaccinated and healthy. We only test them if there is a breakthrough case, if they get a disease, or if they land into the hospital, or even if they die. And so that is basically the reason why the dots between A and B cannot be connected. What we will see is that we will have a decrease on the left-hand side, the curve that is declining of the morbidity, and then there will be a black box, and we will see again the pandemic developing when on the right-hand side, on the red curve, the infectious pressure mounts to an extent that is such that there will be enhanced morbidity now in the non-vaccinated people. And that is where we will again see cases, and that is where again people will be tested. But between A and B, we are not seeing anything because we are not measuring anything, and that is of course a problem. And when we will see all of a sudden the morbidity increasing in the non-vaccinated people, then of course all of a sudden health authorities will say, well, see, that's the problem. These people should take the vaccine, because then we can prevent this. But remember, this in its own right proves already that we don't have, and we will never achieve when we continue like this, herd immunity. Because this is exactly the opposite of what herd immunity is supposed to be. Herd immunity means that the more you vaccinate people, the more you protect those that are not vaccinated, because you should diminish viral excretion and viral shedding. And to some extent that is true. But on the other hand, again, by diminishing this infectious pressure and having a lot of vaccinees that have suboptimal conditions and in the presence of low infectious pressure, highly infectious variants get a competitive advantage, and hence you will increase the infectious pressure to an extent that the non-vaccinated get the disease. So this is a very, very important evolution to understand, and it already illustrates that the enhanced vaccination is not going to lead to herd immunity. So now, the faster the vaccine coverage rates grow, because as you all know, we have different speeds, I would say, of vaccination in different countries. Some countries are vaccinating very aggressively, and others are progressing more slowly. But the faster the vaccine coverage rate grows, the faster the decline in the morbidity rate will be. So this is the curve on the left-hand side that is declining. If you have very aggressive mass vaccination campaign, it will decline very, very fast. But and it can even decline till zero. It theoretically and also practically, and that's what we are seeing in some countries like the Seychelles, etc., that have now reached like a very, very low morbidity and mortality rates that are almost zero. But in the meantime, and the faster you vaccinate, the more important will basically be the lag time for the variants to become dominant in the population. And that is also very normal, because of course if you have very low infectious pressure, then of course it will take some time for the virus to grow and to transmit to numbers that are large enough in order for these infectious variants to become dominant. So this is what is currently happening, and as you will appreciate also from the graphs, it is exactly at this very moment where the decline is maximal that we are relaxing the containment measure, the infection prevention measures. So this, of course, is now going to enhance even the contact between healthy people, vaccinees and non-vaccinees. And as you know, some of these vaccinees are no longer wearing masks even, and are not recommended to wear masks in some states, for example, of the US. So exactly at this very moment where it is become so critical, and where the more infectious variants are breeding more and more, because we get more and more people vaccinated, exactly at that point in time, you are increasing the contact between the vaccinees and the non-vaccinated people. So that is in fact not good news. So what can we do about this, or what is the current recommendation? What is the solution? Well, the solution, officials will say, well, see, you will have enhanced disease in the non-vaccinated, so we need to vaccinate these people as soon as possible. And these are basically the younger people and the children. So, but enhanced vaccine coverage rates, what will they do? They will, again, if we see this increased infection rates in the and disease rates in the non-vaccinated people, it will, of course, raise the infectious pressure again. If you vaccinate them, you will again bring down this infectious pressure, okay? But you will not get rid of these suboptimal conditions, because these people are vaccinated, they will still be mounting antibodies, they will still going through a number of phases where their immune response is suboptimal. And again, this combination of low infectious pressure and suboptimal immune pressure will still favor and promote infectious variants to evolve. But now they will be evolving to withstand a higher level of immune pressure. Why? Well, because we are continuing vaccination, so more and more people get their second shot, more and more people get a full-fledged immune response ready now, and therefore the immune pressure will increase. But again, what I was saying, we are still having the suboptimal conditions, so now the virus will be able to overcome this higher level of immune pressure, which will ultimately lead, in fact, to resistance of the vaccines and the resistance of the virus towards the vaccine. And that is what, if we continue this mass vaccination, I'm sure will happen. So the mantra that mass vaccination basically diminishes the replication of the virus, and that the less virus you have, the less likelihood that variants will circulate, that doesn't apply. But of course, we will not be able to prove this, to demonstrate this, because officials and advising experts will continue to tell, well, we cannot control this viral replication, and therefore we have this huge explosion of variants. And the only way we will be able to prove them wrong is when we can, for God's sake, start to analyze viral shedding in the vaccinees, in the vaccinated people, and also do the sequencing of those viruses, because then and only then will we be able to see that the escape mutations that we see in the virus shed are not randomly selected, but they are first of all selected to be able to withstand a higher immune pressure and to enable higher infectiousness. This is one thing. And as things evolve, these mutations will now also evolve towards selection of mutations that are now even able to resist vaccinal antibodies. So if we do that, if we verify viral shedding in the vaccinated people and we do the sequencing, we will be able to demonstrate and to prove that these selections are not randomly selected, but they are really selected in a way that the infectiousness of the virus is increased and ultimately resists vaccinal antibodies. So immunizing more youngsters and children is scientifically just completely wrong. It's not going to help. It's just going to enhance, to expedite resistance to the vaccine. And when that occurs, of course, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the youngsters nor the elderly when they are vaccinated. And again, when this occurs, it's not a good situation for vaccinated people, because their vaccinal antibodies will no longer work, but they will still suppress their innate antibodies. And then some people say, well, there is this cellular immunity that is cross-protective, etc. No, because people who are vaccinated, they are not primed for this protective cellular responses. The vaccines do not induce cell-mediated immunity that is protective and that is capable of eliminating virus-infected cells. And the other group, the people who are not vaccinated, they will still be able to withstand all kinds of mutants, all kinds of variants, even with high infectiousness, provided the infectious pressure remains low. So these people will have to avoid contacts with, for example, vaccinees who will now be spreading the virus. And they can cope with different viral variants, but they will not be able to rely on cell-induced immunity either, because they have not been primed when they are asymptomatically infected. And second, they can only withstand the variants if they have low infectious pressure. People who will still be better off, may still be better off with those who got a natural infection. Because their immune system got fully primed, as well as the cell-mediated immunity. So what should we do? I mean, this is all very negative. I agree. And therefore, again, we have to turn the tide. We have to stop this mass vaccination immediately. That is one thing. We have to capitalize now on early treatment and also on chemoprophylaxis to dramatically diminish this huge infectious pressure that is now brought about by the highly infectious variants, and that is going to be the reason and the cause why the waves are going to go up again, are going to reappear, and we will see enhanced cases of disease in the non-vaccinated people. And last but not least, we need to work on a new type of vaccines, not the type of second generation of vaccines, because they won't help. They have the same problem. But a type of vaccines that is first not interfering with the immunity of the COVID-19 vaccinees, and that is capable of inducing sterilizing immunity even though natural antibodies are suppressed. So this is to say, capable of inducing sterilizing immunity in people who have been vaccinated with the current COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm convinced that this is the only way to revert the vulnerable immune status of vaccinees that will occur once we have resistance against the vaccine into protective immune status again. So that, I think, is going to be very important. And with that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention.